All right, I'm going to talk about regulatory focus. This theory is essentially a social psychological approach to the glass as half empty, half full. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory, but more specifically about this particular study that I did with a colleague from graduate school at the University of North Texas. So the theory itself is really just a theory about goals and goal achievement and how we intend to produce certain kinds of messages to match the motivation of our receivers. You can also think of it on the flip side of as receiver focused as an information needs. So essentially, certain individuals are oriented towards certain kinds of information. And so that may be information that is about the good things that will happen and information that is about the bad things that will happen. And so if an individual is more concerned with the positive outcome goals, then a message that matches that motivation that they have is going to feel right, or you're going to achieve regulatory fit. So the problem comes in when you start to have a mismatch between the ought and the ideal self. So the ought may be portrayed in a particular message. This is what you ought to do to be safe. But the ideal self, or how we see ourselves, it may not necessarily match up to what I should do to be safe, but the kinds of steps I need to take in order to avoid danger. And so, if the ought self, as portrayed in the message, does not match up with the ideal self or the motivation or information needs that I have, there is a discrepancy, and that discrepancy creates some discomfort. And depending on the way in which there is a discrepant message, I may experience some agitation, so it may make me angry. I may feel dejected. I may feel at a total loss. And so the two basic orientations, because it is derived from social psychologists, it splits the world into black and white, even though it's all the shades in between in reality. But essentially, you have a promotion focused orientation and prevention focused orientation individuals. And the prevention focused individual is concerned about achieving their hopes and dreams and all the good things that could come to pass. And the prevention focused orientation individuals are concerned about avoiding the very specific negative consequences. So Higgins and colleagues refer to this as the hedonic principle. And so the hedonic principle is all about the pain and pleasure continuum. So if you are promotion focused, you are concerned with achieving pleasurable outcomes. And if you are prevention focused, you are more concerned about avoiding painful outcomes. So this particular study, we looked at sleep deprivation. So some of this won't be particularly new. If you recall the fear appeal study that we talked about earlier, and used one of the messages from that study is present here. So a little bit more just as a refresher as to why this might matter. This was a study presented to college students, and obviously sleep deprivation has lots of negative outcomes. There are cardiovascular problems, results in alcohol and drug abuse to compensate for the lack of sleep. 66% of young drivers drive drowsy, which is analogous to driving intoxicated. And obviously it has academic consequences. If you're too tired, you can't focus. So what was missing, that there were limited interventions, there are limited effects of fear appeals, and why don't they work? Because the message processing is there, right? So maybe there's an appropriate level of fear, but we weren't seeing behavior intentions with some of these outcomes. And so why is that? Well, if you think about what a fear appeal does, it presents a prevention focused message. Now, if I am a promotion oriented individual, this message isn't going to work for me. So the question was, if you present people who are on this spectrum of prevention to promotion, does the fear appeal just work, or does it only work for certain kinds of individuals? And so here is a summary of the predictions that we made in this study. And so you can see here the prevention orientation leads to potential agitation. So if there's a mismatch of orientation in the message and the self, leading to the various outcomes in terms of ratings of how complex the message is and derogation. So do I think that the message is overblown, overstated, that you're trying to manipulate me? And obviously, derogation has a negative outcome on persuasiveness, and persuasiveness will predict your behavior intentions. So 300 people participated, a fairly mixed racial background. And the message themselves, as I said, the fear appeal was from the previous study. The regulatory focus measure was included, as well as involvement, and we'll talk more about involvement next week. But the involvement measure that was used here was measuring hedonic relevance, so the hedonic consequences, the pain-pleasure principle. And the complexity and derogation measures I mentioned before, the perceived persuasiveness is from a previous study, and then the 4-item agitation measure, as well as behavior intentions. Now, in this case, behavior intentions was measured with both a general behavior intentions variable, which is the I intend to, I plan to, I will, just like what was present in the previous fear appeal study. But we also included 8 specific items about behavioral intentions, and these were specific to the population of the university at which the data were collected. So at University of North Texas, they have a nap room. I know it sounds insane, but they have it because they're a largely commuter campus. And so one of the questions were, I intend to use the nap room. So I have a space where I could go get more sleep. Will I go do that? And so I'm not going to belabor this particular slide too much, but essentially the question was, did the data fit the model that we laid out? And all of these indices outline that they did. And you could see that by examining all of the paths here. So the little stars indicate significance. And as you can see, that the model explained 45% of people's behavior intentions, which is pretty outstanding. So if you are a prevention-oriented person, you feel less agitation. But if you feel agitation, that's going to result in ratings of complexity and derogation, which in turn decrease persuasiveness. But if you found their message persuasive, you found that you are more likely to engage in the behavior, right? So all that checks out. And so why does that matter? Well, it shows that when we're processing our messages and fear appeals in particular, that the topic itself is going to matter for us. So if we're involved in this topic and it's personally relevant and consequential to us, certainly we need to be mindful of an individual's regulatory orientation. So presenting a prevention message to a promotion-oriented person probably isn't going to work very well. In fact, it makes them agitated and less likely to follow through. It also shows the process in regulatory focus this study does, and there's not a lot of instances of process elsewhere. Higgins and colleagues rely very heavily on ANOVAs to just make the comparisons between the groups, which has its limitations because if this is message processing, there's a process, right? It unfolds over time, and this shows this. And so a future direction maybe looking at the other side of this, so looking at a promotion message and seeing if the promotion orientation limits the amount of dejection that you might feel, and then the top portion of the model could remain consistent. It's also useful to look at more topics. Obviously, sleep deprivation is one that is personally relevant to a particular population, but there's obviously a number of other topics that could be used. There may have been something recent that may have come up that we certainly could look at from a promotion and prevention orientation. But what I wanted to switch over to just for a moment is the actual questionnaire. It's referred to as the event reaction questionnaire, and I just wanted to show you a couple of the items that the scale includes. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. And so it asks you about how frequently these things happen to you. So, compared to most people, are you typically unable to get what you want out of life? Growing up, would you ever cross the line by doing things that your parents would not tolerate? And so the regulatory focus orientation is about asking the sort of general positive outcomes versus the very negative consequences that you avoid. And so, being careful, not being careful enough has gotten me into trouble at times. And so, are you prevention orientation? Are you promotion oriented? Now, interestingly, the promotion oriented individuals tend to prefer a little more abstract knowledge. These are the broad hopes and dreams and goals, and they aren't terribly specific, right? If you think about, how was your day? Oh, it was a good day, right? I don't need, 18 minor details. It's good, right? There's nothing to be concerned about, nothing to focus on, as opposed to a negative consequence like, hey, something terrible is going to happen to you tomorrow. Oh, okay, great, see you tomorrow. No, like, what was it? How's it going to affect me? When's it going to occur? How can I avoid it? Give me the details. I want specifics. And so the prevention orientation individuals tend to prefer much more specific information. So if you put all of that together, you have a kind of a personality attribute of regulatory focus and the kinds of fit that you need to achieve. And so, if you have regulatory fit, you're more likely to see persuasive outcomes. And lack of regulatory fit leads to some negative affective response, which in turn is limiting for persuasive outcomes.